Recording. Yeah. So basically, we're getting to very exciting parsha this week. We could say grand finale, approaching grand finale of a standoff of Moses and the Pharaoh that he's done in request of Hashem himself, of course, coming close to the liberation of Jewish people. And that's why the month of Nisan is actually called the month of redemption, the beginning of the redemption process. But that's the key. The redemption, the freedom, it's actually very, very elusive concept. And I would say, I'm not mistaken, that it is the central topic of the whole story of the Exodus. And it's a process. It's not something that happens overnight. We could say that it's quite amazing that 3,000 years. Hi, Larissa. Thank you for joining us. 3,000 years after the actual physical Exodus recorded in the Torah happens, as we said, freedom remains a very timely and very hot topic indeed. As we know, unfortunately, some people are in physical slavery, still living in the tyrannical and the societies, the dictatorships, when they physically have to escape for their life. And for those of us who are privileged to live in a democratic societies, there is its own type of slavery. The word of Mitzrayim, as we know, means the limitations, the boundaries. And the Pharaoh, so to speak, could be the physical Pharaoh, the tyrant, the despot, or it could be our own internal Pharaoh, some internal voice that could keep us from feeling confident and achieving our full potential. Or it could be just society pushing on us its own beliefs and values, and again, enslaving us, peer pressure, societal pressures, whatever it is, that basically shackles the person either physically or mentally and stops person from achieving their full potential, their purpose of existence in this world. So the Torah actually gives us a very good recipe, the whole step-by-step guide, the road to freedom. And it's been discussed that there are two types of freedom. There is freedom from and freedom to. So the freedom from is just the first step. It's just when the people live in negativity either physical or negativity of a certain situation, negative thoughts, whatever it is. But the second, that's not enough. The second step is actually the freedom to. There have to be a goal, a purpose, moving towards something. So what really is freedom, first of all? And of course, there could be some mistaken concepts of what freedom is also all about. Sometimes society mistakenly associates it with the power or with the ability to do whatever I want. And the Torah actually shows us how being powerful on the surface doesn't necessarily mean being free. We could see that we look at Pharaoh, who thinks that he's the God himself. He thinks that he's self-created man, that he's the ruler of the whole world, son of a son, whatever he calls himself. On the surface, he's the one who rules everybody around. He's the one who enslaved Jewish people and wouldn't let them go. But is he really free? We see very interesting things in the first few plagues. The Torah tells us that when Moses approaches Pharaoh and then Pharaoh says no, and then Hashem actually implements the plagues, the Torah tells us, but Pharaoh hardened his heart. So it sounds like Pharaoh has his own free will, free choice, and he chose to harden his heart, in the words of Torah, and not to respond. But as the narrative proceeds, we could see that the verbiage of the Torah changes. Now we no longer hear that the Pharaoh hardens his heart. The Torah tells us that Hashem hardened Pharaoh's heart. So what's happening over here? Torah never does anything just by accident or by mistake. And this is basically the very fundamental lesson that we get. This is the birth of a tyrant, and inside which there is the tyrant's downfall, but it also shows for all of us who are not really kings or tyrants or despots, or dictators, how their evil inclination, the bad habits, the Yitzhar, how it enslaves the person. Because originally, it seems that the person is in control. We think we're in control. And that we could do. Hello, everybody who joined. Thank you for joining us. I'm subbing for Rochel today. So we think that, I could control my bad habits. I could control my evil inclination. Pharaoh thinks I could control my responses. But eventually it takes over, it enslaves the person. And even if Pharaoh wanted to, he was no longer in control. He was no longer able to respond adequately to the situation that was happening. The people around him are telling him, don't you see that Egypt is lost? Don't you see how much we're suffering now? But it says Hashem hardened his heart. Even if he wanted, he was already enslaved to his own evil inclination and wasn't able to respond at all until he was completely broken man. And this is both the physical Pharaoh, but also as the metaphor of how the internal slavery happening, but how to get out of it. So now Torah gives us the step-by-step guide how to get out of the slavery. We're reading about 10 plagues in the last parasha, in the parasha Bo that upcoming this Shabbat. And the sages often asked, how come there were 10 plagues? Like Hashem is all powerful. He wanted to take Jewish people out of slavery. It was enough just to smack Egyptians, with one huge, powerful thunderstorm, massive flood, whatever it is, and tada, take Jewish people out to freedom. But that will be just very external act. And Hashem, as a creator of people, knew human nature, and he knew that plugging them out of Egypt physically would not plug them out of Egypt mentally, spiritually. We all know the famous expression that we could take person out of Egypt, but it's very difficult to take Egypt out of person. So Hashem implements step-by-step program. So of course, all 10 plagues is also the payment for what the Pharaoh, the Egyptians done to the Jewish slaves. It's basically measure for measure, for all the evil that was done. But at the same time, it's also a lesson, a teaching Jewish people of how to get rid of all this negativity that they accumulated as slaves in Egypt, of that slave mentality. Unfortunately, Jewish people over the years of slavery, of hard labor, they pretty much assimilated in the in the Egyptian society. And they became pretty much indistinguishable from the idol worshippers of the Egypt. And Egypt was worshiping at the time the forces of nature. They worshipped Nile because it was irrigating the land. They worshipped sun. There were a multitude of deities that they were worshiping, and Jewish people became pretty much, it became engraved in them the same idol worship. So every time Hashem was attacking Nile, like the plague of blood and the frogs, attacking the sun, so to speak, with the darkness, with the locust, it was also teaching the Jewish people who really run this world, helping them to disengage themselves from this idol worship habits. It's not Egypt was very much involved in sorcery and believed in magic. And of course, Jewish people who were there believed in it too. So Hashem makes sure there is the third plague, the plague of lice. And if the Pharaoh's magicians were able to recreate the first few plagues, they were not able to recreate a little lice, and they have to consider it's a finger of God. So now it started teaching Jewish people, again, smashing the false gods, smashing the fake deities, and teaching them that it's Hashem really who runs this world. Finally, when the Jewish people were already leave Egypt, Hashem tells Moses to teach Jewish people to do the buy and kill the Paschal lamb. So the question again, why the Paschal lamb? Why that particular sacrifice done in this particular way? And of course, that was another way of liberating Jewish people from that false gods of Egypt, because Egypt was worshiping sheep. And of course, it required lots of bravery for the Jewish people to buy the sheep, the little lamb, to raise it and to slaughter it right in front of the Egyptians who basically worshipped the sheep, and tell them, so again, literally and figuratively, Jewish people were slaughtering all the misconceptions, liberated from all these false ideas on the road to receiving Torah, of receiving the word of Hashem, the word of truth. Now, as I said, that was the freedom from, the liberation from the enslavery, physical, mental, spiritual enslavery of Egypt. Now that was the first step, but as we said, it's not enough. There is also the freedom too. Jewish people had to, especially after they received the Torah, after they were en route to the Promised Land, they have to learn how to become that free society. And this is not easy. It doesn't come naturally. And as we know, even in nowadays, it's not something, the freedom, even if it's hard gained, it's not just something that stays and can be taken for granted. And that's the lesson to all of us in democratic societies as well. They can't take freedom for granted. Every day we have to work to sustain, to ensure that freedom doesn't slip away, as unfortunately has been known happening in history. So again, the Torah gives us a recipe to make sure that the hard-earned freedom actually stays. And one of the very powerful ideas that the Torah gives us is the way to ensure freedom is education of the children. The Torah is very, very high, very focusing on the concept of education. It's quite surprising, actually, when the Jewish people are just liberated out of Egypt and on the en route of becoming a free society. You would expect that Moses, addressing Jewish people, will be talking about maybe some high concept, something you would expect, something like Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, high concepts of freedom, of maybe building some institutions, maybe some major laws governing free society, whatever it is. But that's not what he's talking about at all. He tells them, you have to tell your children. Hashem tells Moses to let Jewish people know, you have to tell your children, you have to teach your children. And as we know, Rabbeinu,
не спал всю ночь, у него часто рано идет спать.
Excuse me, if someone could mute themselves, please. He came through the history not just as Moshe the liberator or Moshe the leader. We know him as Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe is our teacher. And throughout the history of being in the land of Israel and the history of exile, we know that the focus of Jewish people have always been children and education. It's, even the poorest throughout the history in exile, in the darkest time, even the poorest families have always been investing in the education of the children, the immigrants. When they were coming penniless to the new land, first they rushed, to establish the schools, the yeshivot everywhere. So education of the children became a focus. And that was one of the most powerful recipes of transmitting the story. And why is it so important to transmit the story? The summer I was in Prague, and one thing that absolutely impressed me, amazed me, how the people who lived through, the turmoil of 1968, who some of them have to run from the country, the grandparents, the parents, how they were telling the story to the young generation. So there is now a young generation of Czech people who understands and values the freedom. And that's what allows this country to have the Velvet Revolution, to rebuild, to sustain now the free society, because even the young generation, they don't forget the story, they appreciate the freedom. And for the Jewish people, it became very, very important to transmit the story of slavery, of the exile, and make sure that every new generation understands the value of that freedom and doesn't take it for granted. Another important aspect became the communal aspect of it. Of course, the best way as the Jewish people learn to transmit the story to the children is during the Seder. The beautiful Pesach Seder, when the family, intergenerational families gather around the table, and the children the best learn through the medium of stories, songs, visuals. And that's where the Seder becomes the best medium to transmit the beautiful story, the history of the people, so the children know where they're coming from and understand and know where they're going to, and appreciate that they are the link in the chain of generations. But there is something very interesting about the Seder. We read in the Passover Haggadah about 4 children. And each of those children are present at the table, and in their own way, they ask the questions. And of course, we all know that one of the children is called the wicked child. And some of the sages were wondering if it was too harsh. After that, we are talking about children. The child is at the table. Well, the child is asked the question, excluding himself. That wicked son, he said, what is it to you? But after that, is it really the reason to be so harsh and to call the child wicked? And the sages explained that there is very, very dangerous tendency to exclude a person, yourself, but the person themselves decide that they want to exclude themselves from the community. It has a historical connotation. It started from the old times when the Greek Empire tried to Hellenize the Jews. And basically by Hellenizing them, it tried to cut them off from the community, disengage them completely, not only from the Torah and its observance, but from the entire Jewish life, communal life, basically make sure they stop caring. And this is important not only throughout the history, but at our time as well. We know that in all the tyrannical society, in all the democratic societies, the weapon, the most effective propaganda weapon is actually to make sure the people are not getting together. They are completely disengaged. They're disengaged with each other, they're disengaged with any community, and then they could be easily manipulated, of course, and then they feel they're lonely, they're scared, they will not do anything against the power that's trying to oppress them. It's throughout history, that's always been an effective weapon to deal with any descent to tyranny. And this is why our sages in Pirkei Avot we are reading that do not disengage yourself from the community. Maimonides was saying it's a sin. The sinner is the one who is not involved in the community. So we find it's very, very powerful tool of the Jewish people, how they survived through the history, through the dark years of exile, is that the fact that they were always staying together, there was always the power of the community. And the beautiful words of Rabbi Sachs of blessed memory, Judaism is the communal faith. This is the principle that is rebellious child deny, and that's why he's called the wicked. Judaism is not addressed to individuals, nor is it addressed to humanity as a whole. Hashem chose a people and nation and asked them at Mount Sinai to pledge themselves not only to him, but to one another. And as we know at Mount Sinai, basically people answered all as one. There is another interesting thing when Hashem tells Moshe to tell Jewish people at the night that they exit, when the Exodus occurs, not only to make the sacrifice, the Paschal lamb, but to eat it together. So the people were not supposed to get the Paschal sacrifice and to eat it alone. Hashem didn't want it to turn, he was about to build a nation out of the family of the Jewish people, and he wanted that communal feeling already start building up before they even exited slavery. So the people were told to gather as many people as possible into the house when they were eating Paschal lamb, and they were told to stay together in the house, and again helping people to stay in, and even if they had any disagreements, even if they had any differences in opinion, whatever it is, but they had to resolve it inside by breaking bread together, so to speak, by eating the Paschal lamb together. Because we know, for example, how the Jewish people ended up in slavery. Of course, it was Hashem's plan alone, but on the surface of it, it was the hatred between brothers to Joseph that pushed them to sell him into slavery. And yes, there was Hashem's plan, but eventually slavery came about. So basically, the disputes among the Jewish people have never led to anything good. So the idea is that people stay together, they eat together, they learn to stay together as the community, and they learn that even if they might have a difference of opinion or disagree, basically work on these disagreements and to make sure everybody is involved, make sure that everybody is engaged, make sure that everybody feels a part of the Jewish family. And because again, individualism that nowadays, unfortunately, society tries to promote, it doesn't lead to, it eventually leads to the loss of freedom. Because basically it just becomes the boiling pot of individual needs and disagreements that clash with each other. So the society is losing its cohesiveness. And I think it's very, very important to remember it, that the society that is split is in danger of losing the freedom. And last but not least, Hashem tells Moses to tell Jewish people, do not hate the Egyptian, because you were strangers in their land. And on the surface, it sounds strange. What do you mean don't hate the Egyptians? They enslaved us for so many years. They have killed the babies. The Pharaoh said to throw the male babies into Nile. They were doing this, that, and the other. And yet, when they exit from slavery and route to freedom, they are told, do not hate the Egyptian. And interestingly enough, there is an interesting interpretation of some of the Torah scholars that even when Hashem asks the Jewish people, he tells Moses to tell Jewish people to go and borrow all the jewelry, all the valuables from the Egyptians' neighbors. some of the scholars' opinions that in a way it's a gesture to appease Jewish people, to say, okay, you were slaves, but you are not coming out empty-handed. You got some payment for it. So again, towards that end, do not hate the Egyptians. So why is it so important? Because the hatred, even justified hatred, it enslaves the one who hates. It becomes an internal pharaoh, the obstacles to achieving freedom. So if Jewish people continue to develop in this hatred, feeling themselves the victim of Egypt, they would have simply exchanged the external pharaoh for the internal one. And that's a very, very dangerous road, that road of victimhood, when the person learns it's called the learned helplessness, when the people feel they were not the subject with the free will, but they were an object. Something was done to them, on them. They had no will, they were very passive. And that just ties the people with that internal shackles and stops them from moving forward. And of course, nowadays, what comes to mind is the Holocaust survivors who lost so much, who went through the living hell on earth and had so many reasons to hate. And the people that we know are the brightest, the nicest, the forward-looking people. We were privileged. I was privileged to know many of the Holocaust survivors in our community. Always forward-looking people. They chose not to become slaves. They chose that memory, that past, not to enslave them. And they made the right choice. They built the beautiful families. They helped so much to build the beautiful communities, because they wouldn't allow that hatred to paralyze them and stop them from moving forward. This Wednesday is coming, the 10th of Shvat, is the date when the Lubavitch Rebbe took the leadership in 1951. He took the leadership of the Jewry that, of course, at that point was pretty much still reeling from the tragedy of the Holocaust. So many people lost hope, right? So many people felt that all was lost. And yet he was the leader who was like Moses, inspiring people to look forward, to disengage from, not to disengage with the past, to be with the past, but not in the past. Not let the past to put them in the shackle, but actually to rebuild with the hope, to rebuild the new freedom, new way of life. And it's very interesting that in his speech to the high school girls of the New York High School, I think it was Beis Rivka High School, the Rebbe spoke about the concept of time, again, based on one of the commandments for the Rosh Chodesh, the new moon on Parsha Bo. And he was speaking about different aspects of time. The time that is what we know, the time is the killer, the Aristotle's type of time that says either we kill time or it kills us, the useless, the meaningless time that just goes on and on and on and makes us older, and it seems completely meaningless. The second concept of time is the time that's lived with the purpose. And this is when the people don't just pass the days or find something meaningless to fill it with, to fill the void, but they actually do something. They have a goal, they work towards achieving this goal. So it's a very productive time. But at this time, productive as it is, and definitely fulfilling and liberating, it's not really liberating us from the physical limitation, because it's wonderful that people work and achieve their goals, but the time still passes. And Still people have to retire, no matter how fulfilling job was. Children were wonderful. Children are wonderful, but they grow up. So the time still goes by, and it's still nothing we could do about it. But the Rebbe also spoke about the third concept, as he called the liberating time. So that was the time when Hashem told, I am physically taking you out of Egypt, but I also telling you, connect with me, attach with me. And because I am the creator who stands beyond time, above time, I could lift you up. I could liberate you from that whole restriction, the physical restriction of time. So whenever you connect with me, whenever you learn Torah, whenever you do mitzvah, whenever you follow me, it lifts you up beyond all the physical limitations and even the limitations of time as well. So I wish you a wonderful, wonderful Shabbos. I wish everyone a wonderful week, a wonderful month, and a true freedom from any external and any internal pharaohs as well. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Eugenia, for the class. It was very good class. Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
Shabbos, everyone.
Yeah, good Shabbos.
Thank you, Eugenia.